Beloved brethren, throughout sacred scripture, God has often worked in ways that confound human expectation. He chooses moments that appear ordinary, doors that seem familiar, and circumstances that seem small, yet through them, he unfolds his divine plan. From Abraham receiving mysterious visitors to the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, heaven has repeatedly entered history through unexpected encounters. Today, we reflect upon a profound spiritual truth. God may send someone to your door with a surprise that changes everything. Too often, mankind seeks grand signs while neglecting the quiet movements of divine providence. We become absorbed in worldly distractions, forgetting that God operates according to his perfect wisdom, not our limited understanding. The chosen one in God's design is not always marked by earthly power or prestige. Frequently, it is through humble means, through trials, or through unexpected visitors that God calls souls to transformation. This message is not merely about anticipation of an external event, but about the preparation of the soul. For when God intervenes, he does so with purpose, to awaken, to correct, to bless, or to redirect the path of a life. Yet many fail to recognize his visitation because their hearts are not disposed toward grace. Therefore, we must ask ourselves, are we spiritually vigilant? Are we prepared if God sends someone into our lives carrying a message, a test, or even a blessing disguised as difficulty? For divine surprises often demand faith, humility, and obedience. The soul that is prepared will see God's hand, while the distracted soul may miss a moment of eternal significance. Let us reflect deeply upon this truth that God's providence is active, personal, and often arrives when we least expect it. The door at which someone knocks may not only be the door of our home, but the door of our hearts. Man, in his fallen condition, is inclined to seek God only in what appears extraordinary. He desires signs that are unmistakable, manifestations that overwhelm the senses, and interventions that remove all uncertainty. Yet the history of salvation demonstrates repeatedly that God prefers to operate through what appears ordinary, humble, and even hidden. This is not accidental, but is consistent with the divine pedagogy by which God forms the soul. The Lord, in his infinite wisdom, understands that if he were to manifest his power constantly in spectacular ways, man would serve him out of fear or amazement rather than love and obedience. Therefore, divine providence frequently conceals itself beneath circumstances that appear common, and it is precisely within these circumstances that the greatest spiritual transformations occur. When one studies sacred scripture, one notices that God rarely acts according to human expectations. Abraham was not approached by heavenly armies, but by 3 travelers who appeared as ordinary visitors. Yet within that visitation was contained the announcement of a covenant that would alter the entire course of human history. Moses encountered God not in a palace or in triumph, but while tending sheep in the desert, far removed from worldly importance. The burning bush, though miraculous, appeared in the midst of a daily duty, demonstrating that God often inserts his divine will into the routine responsibilities of life. These examples reveal a consistent pattern. God chooses what appears insignificant in order to accomplish what is eternally significant. This divine method serves several purposes. First, it humbles man. The human person, wounded by pride, desires to control circumstances and predict outcomes. When God works through unexpected and ordinary means, he reminds the soul that it is not the master of its own destiny, but is dependent upon divine governance. Humility is the foundation of all spiritual growth, and without it, no soul can advance in holiness. When God sends his grace through an unexpected visitor, a sudden trial, or an unforeseen opportunity, he is often dismantling the structures of pride that prevent the soul from surrendering to him. Second, God's use of ordinary means tests faith. Faith, by its nature, requires trust in what is not fully visible or comprehensible. If divine interventions were always obvious and overwhelming, faith would lose much of its merit. The soul demonstrates genuine faith when it recognizes God's hand, even when his presence is veiled. This is why many individuals encounter moments of profound grace, yet fail to recognize them. They expect God to speak through thunder while ignoring the quiet whisper of providence that directs their lives through people, circumstances, and events that appear natural. Moreover, God's preference for humble instruments reveals his sovereignty. By choosing what is weak in the eyes of the world, he demonstrates that the power belongs entirely to him. Throughout history, the Lord has chosen shepherds, fishermen, children, and the poor to carry out his divine purposes. This is not merely symbolic, it is a direct contradiction of worldly logic. The world values strength, influence, and prestige, while God values obedience, purity of intention, and openness to grace. When God sends someone into a person's life who appears insignificant or unexpected, he is often revealing that his grace operates independently of worldly qualifications. Another important aspect of this truth is that divine providence frequently disguises blessings as trials. A sudden difficulty, an interruption to one's plans, or the arrival of a challenging individual may initially appear as misfortune. However, God often uses these situations to purify the soul, detach it from worldly attachments, and draw it closer to eternal realities. The saints consistently testify that their greatest spiritual growth occurred during periods of suffering or confusion rather than during times of comfort. This demonstrates that God's surprises are not always pleasant in a worldly sense, but they are always ordered toward the ultimate good of the soul. It is also necessary to understand that God respects human freedom while guiding history toward his divine ends. He does not force his will upon individuals in a manner that destroys their liberty. Instead, he presents opportunities for cooperation with grace. When someone arrives in a person's life carrying a message, a correction, or an invitation to change, that moment becomes a crossroads. The individual may accept the grace offered or reject it. Many of the tragedies in spiritual life occur not because God failed to act, but because man failed to recognize and respond to his action. The failure to perceive God's providence often stems from spiritual negligence. A soul immersed in constant distraction, attachment to worldly pleasures, or habitual sin gradually loses the sensitivity required to recognize divine movements. Just as physical senses can be dulled by overexposure to noise or stimulation, spiritual senses can be dulled by excessive attachment to temporal concerns. Prayer, silence, and examination of conscience are essential practices that sharpen spiritual perception. Through these disciplines, the soul becomes attentive to the subtle ways in which God communicates his will. Furthermore, God's use of unexpected means teaches reliance upon grace rather than self-sufficiency. Modern culture encourages the illusion that man can engineer his own happiness and control every aspect of his future. Divine providence disrupts this illusion by introducing events that cannot be predicted or controlled. These moments force the soul to confront its limitations and to seek assistance beyond human capability. In doing so, God invites the individual into a deeper relationship with him, one founded upon trust and dependence. One must also consider that God's providential surprises often have consequences that extend beyond the individual. When God sends a person or circumstance that transforms one life, the effects frequently ripple outward, influencing families, communities, and even future generations. The history of the church is filled with examples of individuals whose encounters with grace led to widespread spiritual renewal. These transformations began not with grand public events, but with personal moments of obedience to unexpected divine invitations. Ultimately, the recognition of God's providence requires a disposition of interior recollection. The soul must cultivate an awareness that every moment contains the possibility of divine intervention. This awareness does not produce anxiety, but fosters peace, because it assures the believer that life is not governed by chaos or randomness, but by a loving and intelligent creator. When a person embraces this truth, he begins to view every encounter, every interruption, and every surprise as potentially carrying eternal significance. Thus, the arrival of an unexpected individual or circumstance should not be dismissed as mere coincidence. In the economy of salvation, coincidence is often the language through which divine providence speaks. The soul that lives in humility, vigilance, and prayer will gradually learn to discern these moments and respond with generosity. In doing so, it enters more fully into the divine plan, discovering that God's greatest works are often hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. waiting to be recognized by those who possess the eyes of faith. The spiritual life is fundamentally a life of preparation. Man often believes that the decisive moments of his life will be obvious, that he will somehow recognize when God is calling him to respond in a significant manner. Yet experience and the testimony of the saints reveal a very different reality. God frequently acts when the soul least expects it, and his interventions often occur suddenly, requiring an immediate response. The tragedy is that many souls fail to respond correctly because they have neglected the daily discipline of spiritual readiness. Spiritual readiness is not a temporary state achieved only during moments of crisis, but rather a habitual disposition of the soul that is cultivated through consistent cooperation with grace. The necessity of spiritual readiness is rooted in the unpredictable nature of divine visitation. Our Lord himself warned that the Son of Man would come at an hour when he is not expected. This warning is not limited to the final judgment, but extends to the countless moments throughout life when God visits the soul with grace, correction, or blessing. These visitations can take the form of opportunities for repentance, invitations to greater holiness, or trials designed to purify the heart. The soul that is unprepared is often caught in a state of attachment to sin, distraction, or spiritual complacency, making it incapable of responding generously when grace is offered. One of the primary obstacles to spiritual readiness is the illusion that conversion can be postponed. Many individuals acknowledge the importance of holiness, but assume they will pursue it at a later time. They intend to abandon sinful habits, deepen their prayer life, or correct moral weaknesses eventually, but not immediately. This procrastination is one of the most dangerous deceptions in the spiritual life. Grace is offered in the present moment, and when it is repeatedly ignored, the heart becomes hardened. Over time, the soul loses its sensitivity to divine promptings, and what once appeared as a clear invitation to holiness becomes barely noticeable. Spiritual readiness requires vigilance over one's interior life. The human heart is a battlefield where various influences compete for dominance. Disordered desires, worldly attachments, and the subtle temptations of the enemy constantly attempt to weaken the soul's orientation toward God. Without deliberate effort, these influences gradually establish themselves as habits, making it increasingly difficult for the soul to respond to grace. Vigilance involves regular self-examination, honest recognition of faults, and sincere efforts to correct them. This process is often uncomfortable because it requires confronting aspects of oneself that one would prefer to ignore. However, without this interior honesty, true readiness is impossible. Prayer is the foundation upon which spiritual readiness is built. Through prayer, the soul remains connected to God and becomes receptive to his guidance. Prayer is not merely the recitation of words, but the elevation of the mind and heart toward God. When a person maintains a consistent prayer life, he develops an awareness of God's presence that extends beyond formal moments of devotion. This awareness enables the soul to recognize divine movements even in the midst of daily activities. Conversely, when prayer is neglected, the soul becomes spiritually lethargic, easily distracted, and incapable of discerning God's will. Another essential element of spiritual readiness is detachment from worldly attachments. This does not mean rejecting legitimate responsibilities or relationships, but it does require maintaining proper order in one's affections. When the heart becomes excessively attached to comfort, reputation, possessions, or personal ambitions, it resists anything that threatens these attachments. Yet God often calls souls to growth through circumstances that require sacrifice or change. A soul that clings too tightly to worldly security will instinctively resist divine invitations that demand trust and surrender. A detachment frees the heart to respond generously to God's will, even when it involves uncertainty or difficulty. Spiritual readiness also involves the cultivation of virtue. Virtue is not merely the avoidance of sin, but the habitual inclination toward what is good. When virtues such as humility, patience, charity, and obedience are firmly established, the soul is prepared to respond correctly to unexpected events. For example, humility allows a person to accept correction without resentment, while patience enables enduring trials. Charity motivates the soul to see others as instruments of God's providence rather than as inconveniences. Virtue transforms the soul into fertile ground where grace can produce abundant spiritual fruit. It is important to recognize that God's surprises often require immediate decisions. There are moments in life when hesitation can result in lost grace, when an opportunity to reconcile with someone arises, when a call to abandon a sinful habit becomes clear, or when a chance to perform an act of charity presents itself. The soul must respond promptly. Delay frequently leads to rationalization and eventual refusal. Spiritual readiness ensures that when such moments occur, the soul possesses the clarity and strength necessary to act in accordance with God's will. The saints provide profound examples of spiritual readiness. They were not individuals who became holy through extraordinary circumstances alone, but rather through faithful attention to daily responsibilities and consistent cooperation with grace. Their readiness allowed them to recognize God's will, even when it appeared disguised within suffering or humiliation. Many saints received their greatest graces during moments that seemed insignificant or painful to others. Their preparedness enabled them to embrace these moments as opportunities for union with God. Another dimension of readiness involves acceptance of suffering. Modern society often views suffering as meaningless or purely negative, but within the Christian understanding, suffering can be a powerful instrument of sanctification. When God permits trials, he often intends to purify the soul, detach it from earthly illusions, and strengthen its dependence upon him. A spiritually prepared soul does not seek suffering, but accepts it with trust when it arrives. Such acceptance transforms suffering from a source of despair into a means of spiritual growth. Spiritual readiness is also closely connected to hope. Hope is the confident expectation that God is working for the ultimate good of the soul, even when circumstances appear confusing or painful. Without hope, unexpected events often produce fear or resentment. With hope, the soul approaches surprises with trust, believing that God's providence is guiding every situation toward a greater purpose. Hope provides stability during uncertainty and enables the soul to remain faithful even when God's plan is not immediately understood. Ultimately, spiritual readiness is a state of continual openness to God's will. It is the recognition that every moment of life carries eternal significance. The prepared soul lives with an awareness that God may speak through any person, event, or circumstance. This awareness produces neither anxiety nor scrupulosity, but rather a peaceful attentiveness. The soul becomes like a watchful servant who remains ready to welcome the master whenever he arrives. When spiritual readiness is cultivated, the soul experiences a profound transformation in its perception of life. Events that once appeared random or inconvenient are recognized as opportunities for grace. Encounters with others are approached with reverence, recognizing that God may be acting through them. Even difficulties are viewed within the context of divine providence. The prepared soul begins to live not merely according to human planning, but according to a deeper trust in God's guidance. Thus, spiritual readiness is not an optional aspect of the Christian life, but an essential requirement. Without it, divine visitations may pass unnoticed, and opportunities for holiness may be lost. With it, the soul becomes capable of responding generously to every grace God offers, gradually conforming itself to his will and advancing toward the ultimate purpose for which it was created, union with him in eternal glory. The history of God's interaction with mankind reveals a consistent and striking truth. God chooses his instruments according to his own divine wisdom, which often stands in direct opposition to human expectations. Man, guided by fallen reasoning, naturally associates effectiveness with power, influence, intelligence, and social status. He believes that those who possess visible strength are the most suitable vessels for accomplishing significant tasks. Yet God repeatedly demonstrates that his ways are not the ways of man. He deliberately selects individuals who appear weak, insignificant, or unlikely in order to accomplish his greatest works. This divine pattern serves to reveal both the sovereignty of God and the necessity of humility in the soul that desires to cooperate with him. From the earliest pages of sacred scripture, this principle is evident. God did not choose the strongest kingdoms or the most powerful nations to establish his covenant. Instead, he selected a single man, Abraham, who possessed no earthly empire, and whose circumstances appeared barren and uncertain. Abraham's selection was not based upon worldly qualifications, but upon his willingness to trust and obey. In this, God established a spiritual precedent. Divine selection is based upon disposition of the heart rather than external ability. This pattern continues throughout salvation history, demonstrating that God's work is accomplished through those who are willing to surrender themselves entirely to his will. The selection of Moses further illustrates this truth. By human standards, Moses appeared unqualified for leadership. He doubted his own ability to speak, hesitated when confronted with responsibility, and had lived as a fugitive shepherd in the desert. Yet God deliberately chose him to confront the most powerful ruler of his time and to lead an entire people toward liberation. This choice reveals a fundamental spiritual reality. God does not require natural perfection in his instruments. Rather, he often permits human weakness to remain so that his grace may be more clearly manifested. When divine power operates through human frailty, it becomes evident that the success of the mission belongs to God alone. This principle reaches its most profound expression in the incarnation itself. The Savior of the world did not enter history through imperial authority or worldly grandeur. Instead, he was born into poverty, raised in obscurity, and surrounded by individuals who were socially and politically insignificant. The Blessed Virgin Mary, chosen to bear the Son of God, was not selected because of worldly prestige, but because of her purity, humility, and complete submission to God's will. Her response demonstrates the interior qualities that God seeks in those he chooses: openness to grace, unwavering faith, and total obedience. God's preference for humble instruments directly challenges the pride that dominates human society. Pride seeks recognition, power, and control. It measures success according to visible achievements and external validation. When God selects individuals who lack these worldly markers of importance, he exposes the emptiness of pride and reveals the true foundation of spiritual authority. The soul that is filled with pride resists being used by God because it desires to direct its own path and receive personal glory. Conversely, the humble soul recognizes its dependence upon God and becomes a willing vessel through which divine grace can operate freely. Another aspect of this divine selection is that God often uses individuals to serve as instruments in the spiritual growth of others. Sometimes the person sent by God is not immediately recognized as a bearer of grace. He may appear as a source of correction, challenge, or even suffering. Yet these individuals frequently play a crucial role in the sanctification of those they encounter. Throughout the lives of the saints, one finds numerous examples of individuals who served as unexpected agents of spiritual transformation. These encounters reveal that God's chosen instruments are not always those who bring comfort, but often those who bring truth and purification. It is also important to understand that God's choice of instruments reflects his desire to transform not only those who receive grace, but also those through whom grace is delivered. When God chooses an individual to carry out his will, he simultaneously sanctifies that person through the responsibilities and trials associated with the mission. The chosen instrument often undergoes profound purification, learning to rely entirely upon God rather than personal strength. In this way, divine selection becomes a means of mutual sanctification, benefiting both the instrument and those affected by his or her actions. Human reasoning frequently struggles to accept this reality because it contradicts natural expectations of order and efficiency. The world tends to place confidence in institutions, systems, and visible authority. While these have legitimate roles, they are never the ultimate source of spiritual transformation. God demonstrates repeatedly that true change begins with individual souls who are willing to cooperate with grace. A single obedient person can become the catalyst for widespread renewal because God's power operates without limitation when it encounters genuine surrender. Furthermore, God's choice of unlikely instruments serves as a test for those who receive their message or influence. It is often difficult for individuals to accept correction, guidance, or assistance from someone who appears inferior according to worldly standards. Pride resists acknowledging that God may speak through those who lack social authority or intellectual prestige, yet spiritual maturity requires the recognition that God's voice can be communicated through any person he chooses. The refusal to accept this truth has led many souls to reject grace simply because it arrived through an unexpected source. This divine method also encourages the development of spiritual discernment. The faithful are called to evaluate individuals not according to external appearances, but according to the fruits of grace present in their lives. True instruments of God are recognized by their conformity to divine truth, their practice of virtue, and their fidelity to God's will. Such discernment protects the soul from deception while allowing it to remain open to genuine divine intervention. Another significant aspect of God's selection is that it emphasizes the universality of the call to holiness. If God relied solely upon individuals possessing extraordinary natural abilities, holiness would appear unattainable for most people. By choosing ordinary individuals, God reveals that sanctity is accessible to every soul, regardless of social status, education, or personal history. This truth provides profound hope because it assures each person that God can use his life as part of his divine plan. It is also necessary to recognize that being chosen by God does not guarantee comfort or worldly success. Those selected as instruments often encounter misunderstanding, opposition, and suffering. Their mission may require sacrifices that appear unreasonable from a purely human perspective. Yet these trials serve to purify their intentions and strengthen their reliance upon divine grace. The lives of the saints demonstrate that God's chosen instruments frequently endure great hardship precisely because their mission carries eternal significance. Ultimately, the truth that God chooses his instruments according to his will calls every soul to cultivate humility and openness. One must abandon the tendency to measure personal worth according to worldly achievements and instead seek conformity with God's desires. Likewise, one must remain attentive to the possibility that God may send individuals into one's life as instruments of grace, even when they appear unexpected or unremarkable. When this truth is embraced, the soul begins to perceive human relationships in a new light. Every encounter becomes a potential channel through which God may communicate his will. The believer learns to approach others with reverence, recognizing that God often works through hidden and ordinary means. In doing so, the soul becomes both receptive to grace and capable of serving as an instrument through which God can reach others. Thus, the divine choice of instruments stands as a profound testimony to God's wisdom, power, and mercy. It reveals that the effectiveness of God's work does not depend upon human strength, but upon the soul's willingness to cooperate with grace. Through this divine method, God continuously reminds mankind that his plans surpass human understanding and that his greatest works are accomplished through those who are humble enough to allow him to act through them. When God intervenes in the life of a soul, his purpose is never superficial or temporary. Divine intervention is always ordered toward transformation, for the ultimate intention of God is to restore man to the image and likeness for which he was created. Sin has distorted this image, weakening the intellect, disordering the will, and darkening the understanding of truth. Therefore, when God enters the circumstances of a person's life through unexpected events, encounters, or trials, he does so with the intention of reshaping the soul according to divine perfection. Such transformation is rarely comfortable, for it involves the gradual dismantling of attachments, illusions, and habits that separate the soul from God. Human beings naturally resist transformation because it requires change, and change threatens the security found in familiarity. Even when a person recognizes that certain aspects of his life are disordered, he often hesitates to surrender them because they provide a sense of control or comfort. Yet God, in his mercy, refuses to leave the soul imprisoned within these limitations. Divine encounters frequently confront the individual with truths that demand conversion. This confrontation may arrive through a person who challenges one's behavior, through circumstances that expose hidden weaknesses, or through suffering that reveals the fragility of worldly security. In each case, God is not punishing the soul, but inviting it into a deeper participation in his divine life. Transformation through divine intervention often begins with illumination. The soul becomes aware of realities that were previously ignored or misunderstood. This illumination can take many forms: recognition of personal sin, awareness of a neglected vocation, or realization of the emptiness of worldly pursuits. Such awareness is itself a grace, for without it, the soul remains trapped in spiritual blindness. However, illumination alone is insufficient. It must be followed by a deliberate decision to cooperate with grace. The soul must choose whether to accept the truth revealed by God or to retreat into denial and resistance. The process of transformation also involves purification. Once the soul begins to respond to divine grace, God often permits trials that remove disordered attachments and strengthen virtue. This purification can be interior or exterior. Interior purification involves the struggle against sinful habits, disordered desires, and spiritual complacency. Exterior purification may involve loss, suffering, misunderstanding, or circumstances that challenge personal comfort. These trials are not arbitrary but are carefully permitted by God to remove obstacles that prevent the soul from achieving deeper union with Him. The saints frequently testify that their greatest spiritual progress occurred during periods of intense purification, for it was during these moments that they learned complete dependence upon divine grace. Another aspect of divine transformation is the reordering of priorities. Before encountering God's intervention, many individuals structure their lives around temporal goals such as wealth, reputation, or personal ambition. While these pursuits may not be inherently sinful, they often become disordered when they overshadow the ultimate purpose of life, which is union with God. Divine encounters frequently disrupt these priorities, forcing the individual to reconsider what truly possesses lasting value. A person who experiences such transformation begins to measure success not by worldly achievements, but by fidelity to God's will and growth in virtue. Transformation through divine intervention also reshapes relationships. When a soul draws closer to God, its interactions with others begin to reflect divine charity. The individual becomes more patient, more forgiving, and more attentive to the needs of others. This change is not merely behavioral, but flows from an interior conversion of the heart. The person begins to see others not as obstacles or instruments of personal advancement, but as souls created by God and deserving of love and compassion. Such transformation often has a profound influence on families, communities, and social environments, demonstrating that divine intervention in one life can produce widespread spiritual renewal. It is important to recognize that divine transformation is usually gradual rather than instantaneous. While some conversions occur dramatically, most spiritual growth unfolds through a series of encounters and responses to grace over time. God respects the natural development of the soul, allowing it to grow in virtue through repeated acts of obedience and trust. This gradual process requires perseverance, for the soul may experience periods of dryness, confusion, or discouragement. Yet these difficulties are often permitted by God to strengthen faith and purify intentions, ensuring that the transformation is rooted in genuine love rather than emotional enthusiasm. Another dimension of divine transformation is the development of spiritual detachment. As the soul progresses in holiness, it begins to recognize the transient nature of earthly realities. This recognition does not lead to indifference toward responsibilities or relationships, but it produces a freedom that allows the soul to use worldly goods without becoming enslaved by them. Detachment enables the individual to accept both prosperity and adversity with equal trust in God's providence. Such freedom is a clear sign of transformation because it demonstrates that the soul's security is no longer rooted in temporal circumstances but in divine faithfulness. Divine transformation also prepares the soul for mission. When God reshapes a life, He often intends that transformed individual to serve as an instrument of grace for others. This mission may take many forms, ranging from public ministry to hidden acts of charity and witness. The transformed soul becomes a living testimony to the power of divine grace, inspiring others to seek God. In this way, transformation is never purely personal, but contributes to the broader work of salvation within the world. It must also be understood that transformation through divine intervention frequently involves suffering. Suffering, when united with God's will, becomes a powerful means of sanctification. It purifies the heart, deepens compassion, and strengthens reliance upon divine grace. The world often interprets suffering as meaningless or purely negative, but within the spiritual life, it can become a profound participation in the redemptive work of Christ. The soul that embraces suffering with faith discovers that it becomes a source of spiritual strength and deeper union with God. Resistance to divine transformation often arises from fear. The soul fears losing control, comfort, or identity. Yet such fear is rooted in misunderstanding, for God never removes anything from the soul without intending to replace it with something greater. Divine transformation does not diminish the person, but perfects him, allowing him to become fully what he was created to be. The surrender required for this transformation is difficult, but it leads to a freedom and peace that cannot be achieved through worldly means. Ultimately, divine encounters that bring transformation reveal the profound love God has for each soul. God does not remain distant or indifferent to human struggle. He actively enters the circumstances of life, guiding, correcting, and strengthening those who are willing to respond to his grace. Every divine surprise carries within it the possibility of profound renewal, drawing the soul closer to eternal communion with God. Thus, when God intervenes through unexpected individuals or circumstances, the purpose extends far beyond immediate change. It is an invitation to a lifelong journey of conversion, purification, and sanctification. The soul that responds with humility and trust gradually experiences a complete reorientation of its desires, priorities, and understanding of reality. Through this transformation, the individual begins to reflect the divine image more clearly, fulfilling the ultimate purpose for which human life was created: to know, love, and serve God, and to share in his eternal glory. The spiritual life requires not only openness to divine action, but also the careful exercise of discernment. While God actively guides the soul through various events, encounters, and inspirations, not every influence that appears meaningful or sudden originates from him. The human heart exists within a complex spiritual battlefield where divine grace, human inclination, and diabolical deception often intersect. Without discernment, the soul risks confusing emotional impulse, worldly pressure, or spiritual deception with genuine divine guidance. Therefore, the ability to distinguish between what comes from God and what does not is essential for those who seek to walk faithfully according to his will. Discernment begins with an understanding of the nature of God's action. God operates in perfect harmony with truth, virtue, and the moral law. He never contradicts his own commandments or encourages actions that lead the soul into sin. Any influence that promotes disobedience to divine law, even if it appears beneficial or emotionally appealing, cannot originate from God. This principle forms the foundation of authentic discernment, for it anchors the soul in objective truth rather than subjective feeling. Many individuals fall into spiritual confusion because they rely primarily on emotional experience rather than measuring inspirations against the unchanging standards of divine revelation. Another essential element of discernment is the cultivation of interior silence. Modern life is saturated with noise, distraction, and constant stimulation, all of which hinder the soul's ability to perceive spiritual realities clearly. God often speaks in subtle and quiet ways, requiring the soul to withdraw from excessive external influences in order to recognize his voice. Interior silence is not merely the absence of sound, but the deliberate calming of disordered thoughts, anxieties, and desires. Through prayer, meditation, and recollection, the soul becomes capable of perceiving the gentle movements of grace that would otherwise be overshadowed by the chaos of daily life. Discernment also requires humility. Pride is one of the greatest obstacles to recognizing God's guidance because it inclines the soul to trust its own judgment above all else. A proud individual assumes that his interpretations and desires are automatically correct, making him vulnerable to deception. Humility, on the other hand, acknowledges the limitations of human understanding and remains open to correction. The humble soul seeks guidance through prayer, consultation with wise spiritual counsel, and careful reflection. By recognizing its dependence upon God, the humble soul becomes more receptive to authentic divine direction. One of the primary methods through which God communicates his will is through consistency with virtue. Genuine divine inspiration leads the soul toward greater charity, patience, purity, and obedience. It produces peace even when it requires sacrifice. Conversely, influences that originate from disordered passions or spiritual deception often produce agitation, pride, or excessive emotional excitement that lacks stability. While divine guidance may challenge the soul, it does not create confusion or moral disorder. Over time, the fruits of an inspiration reveal its origin, for that which comes from God leads to deeper holiness and interior peace. Discernment also involves an awareness of the tactics of spiritual deception. The enemy of the soul rarely tempts individuals openly toward obvious evil. Instead, he often disguises temptation within what appears good or reasonable. He may encourage excessive zeal that leads to spiritual burnout, false humility that undermines legitimate responsibilities, or emotional enthusiasm that replaces disciplined virtue. These subtle distortions are particularly dangerous because they mimic genuine spiritual movements. The soul must therefore evaluate inspirations not only by their initial appearance, but by their long-term consequences and their conformity to divine truth. Another important aspect of discernment is patience. Human beings often desire immediate clarity regarding God's will, but divine guidance frequently unfolds gradually. Impulsive decisions made without careful reflection can lead the soul away from authentic grace. Patience allows time for prayer, consultation, and observation of spiritual fruits. When an inspiration truly originates from God, it remains consistent and strengthens over time rather than fading or producing instability. Patience protects the soul from acting prematurely based on emotions or external pressure. Discernment is also closely connected to obedience. God frequently confirms his will through legitimate authority, spiritual guidance, and the teachings of the church. The soul that isolates itself from these sources of guidance becomes vulnerable to self-deception. Obedience does not diminish personal freedom, but safeguards it by aligning individual judgment with divine wisdom transmitted through established spiritual structures.